So today we're going to talk about some vocabulary. A lot of these words you may be familiar with from the sixth grade. There may be a word or two that is new to you. We're going to talk about a ratio, rate, unit rate, complex fraction, equivalent fractions, and proportions. So I've made a foldable, and those of you traditional students, you will be completing this foldable. Online students, it would not hurt for you to take some notes. So the first thing we want to discuss is what is a ratio. And a ratio is just a comparison of two quantities using division. And there are three ways to write a ratio. First, we can use the word to. So for instance, I can say 2 to 5. I could use a colon. 2 to 5. I could also write that as a fraction. 2 to 5. We would just say 2/5. The next vocabulary word we want to talk about is a rate. So a rate is just a ratio comparing quantities with different units. And what I mean by that, well, for instance, I could say that I'm drinking a half a gallon of milk every 30 minutes. That's a lot of milk, guys. So if you notice, our units are gallons and minutes. They're different because gallon is measuring volume and minutes is measuring time. Those are two totally different concepts. So that's why it's a rate, because we have different units. Next, we're going to talk about a unit rate. And a unit rate is just a rate with a denominator of 1. And remember, when we have fractions, the number on the top of the fraction we call the numerator, and the number on the bottom of the fraction we call the denominator. So if you look, we have 2 people in 1 car. And that is the unit rate because the denominator is 1. The next thing that we're going to talk about is a complex fraction. And guys, we're going to focus heavily on complex fractions. Okay, so a complex fraction is just a fraction that contains a fraction in the numerator and the denominator, or both. So you see here we have the fraction 1/2 over 3/4. Guys, just because we have a fraction doesn't mean we go to pieces. That fraction is the same thing as this down here. 1/2 divided by 3/4. This is the form you're more familiar with. But it means the same thing. And you know how to deal with that. We'll discuss that later. Moving on. The next vocabulary we're going to talk about is equivalent fractions. And you've been dealing with equivalent fractions for a long time. Equivalent fractions are just two ratios or fractions that express the same relationship between numbers. For instance, if I gave you the fraction 1/2 and I asked you to give me an equivalent fraction, a lot of you would easily be able to say 2/4. Those are equivalent fractions. And notice I said they express the same relationship between numbers. Well, what I mean by that? Well, look right here. How do I go from 1 to 2? And guys, make sure in the 7th grade, you're really looking for what can I multiply by and what can I divide by. That's called multiplicative reasoning, okay? So, in order to go from 1 to 2, I just multiply 1 by 2, and that gives me 2. Well, look over here. I can do the same thing. How do I go from 2 to 4? 2 times 2 is 4. So they have the same relationship. I'm multiplying my numerator by 2 to get my denominator. And the last vocabulary term that we want to discuss is proportions. So a proportion, I can't get this to move. A proportion is just an equation or statement of equality between two ratios. And guys, when I say ratios, you can also think of ratios as fractions. Essentially, they're the same thing. Okay? So, if I write 1/2 equals 2/4, that is an equation because we have the equal symbol. Therefore, that is a proportion.